Welcome into the Season 2 U recap. If you haven't seen the recap for Season 1, just search on my channel page. You'll be easily able to find it. But after Candace shows up, the two go have a very public lunch, and Candace is making him sweat as she draws out what she wants from him. The whole time, Joe looks more and more uncomfortable until finally he excuses himself to go to the bathroom, but in reality, he slips out the back door. He tries to leave town, but Candace has his phone number, and right before he does, she calls him up and says, "I'm going to hunt you down and make you feel like who you actually are, because sending you to prison is just way too easy." So Joe heads to a city that he thinks Candace thinks he hates. Los Angeles. He gets a new identity. He's going by the name Will Biddleheim, although I'll probably still call him Joe. He gets a new place to live in an apartment complex, and while he's surveying the people that live there, just like he did in the bookstore, he's interrupted by a little 15-year-old girl named Ellie who's filling him in into who everybody is in the apartment complex and what they do, including her older sister who she lives with named Delilah, who's a gossip blogger. Now Joe needs a job, and he heads to basically a bougier Whole Foods, a place called Anavrin. And while the fit to work there isn't great, he slips in a crime and punishment book, and it gets him immediately hired peddling books at the store. I mean, think of if Barnes & Noble's main thing was food and not books. You have your little side cafe. That's where they sell the books. And right after his first shift, he runs into Love Quinn, who immediately catches his eye. As he's doing the same thing he did to Beck, he stops himself and says, no, you can't do this again. But the two start flirting a little bit, and he finds out that she actually works in the store as one of the chefs. So he'll be running into her quite a bit. He also runs into the owner's kid, a guy named 40, who is the definition of a California douchebag. And it's pretty clear that this guy pushes the staff around. He's still very paranoid, however, about Candace catching him. And as he's walking home, he notices Ellie filming him from the roof of their apartment complex. So he heads up there and demands to know, "Who told you to film me?" She says, "Nobody." He reaches for the phone, but the phone falls off the roof and cracks. And she says, "You dickhead, I was filming something for school." So now he needs to get her a new cell phone, but he also needs to get a new license. So he heads to the DMV, and he runs into Love there as well. She's defending an Arabic woman, and they happen to do the, "Oh, hey, what are you doing here" thing. And since it seems like the universe is telling him something by these two chance encounters, he decides afterwards to look her up on Facebook and Instagram. But unlike Beck and just about everybody else that lives in California, her profiles are set to private. So he needs to come up with an alternative plan. He heads to the phone store, gets Ellie a new phone, and as she's setting it up, she notices that one of the accounts is fake, and he says, "How do you know it's fake?" And she's pointing out all the things that show that an account isn't actually a real account. So he processes all this new data and sets up his own new Facebook and a new Instagram. And while he hates himself for it, it's necessary. He heads to the park, friend requests Love, and then falls asleep and has a dream about the day that his mother abandoned him. When he wakes up, he's sunburned, but Love has also accepted his friend request, and he'll gladly take that trade-off. Unfortunately for Joe, however, it says that she's married. He heads home, and somehow Love found out that he called out of work sick and also where he lives, and she heads on over there to patch him up from the sunburn. She also notices that he has no food, and since he's new to town, she decides, as a chef, to take him to all these different places and figure out what his palate is. After taking him to a few spots, she finally thinks she has his palate figured out. So they head back to Anavrin, and she ends up cooking him up this dish to get his, quote, perfect bite. As the two are sharing a moment, she says, "I have to tell you something. I was married, but my husband died. He got sick, and we got married when we were young, and it's weird enough getting married that early, but then also being this young and being a widower. But I can also tell when someone's dealt with a similar loss. When I look into your eyes, I see that you've dealt with that." And boy, has he ever. As a parting gift for the night, she gives him a book of a poet that she cannot believe Joe hasn't dived into. And Joe Goldberg is officially smitten. He heads home and he's greeted by Ellie, who shows him a picture of a guy and says, "Hey, this guy's name's Jasper. He was here looking for you. He said you have something of his." And you gotta remember, Joe is using a fake name. She also points out that the guy was kind of creepy. Joe waits for her to go into her apartment, and when she does, he heads out, goes to a storage facility, and there in the storage facility is not only the cage, but some guy in the cage. And that guy is the real Will Biddleheim. And Joe wants to know who Jasper is and why he's looking for him. And while this whole time Joe has been playing it off like he knows he can't get into a relationship, the reality is Love caught his eye and he did everything in his power not only to get a job in the same place that she works at, but also to get an apartment right across the street where he can spy on her. Upon getting to LA, Joe realized he needs a fake ID, and he meets a guy on Craigslist, and that is the real Will Biddleheim. And Will is bragging about how long it took him to get this squeaky clean image, perfect credit score, and there's not a picture trace of what he looks like on the internet. But that takes years. And since Joe doesn't have that, he just ends up knocking him out with a brick and stealing his identity. It took him 2 days to recreate the cage in that storage facility, but that's where the real Will Biddleheim is right now. and Joe wants to know who the hell is Jasper. And Will met Jasper on the dark web, but the two never actually met face to face. And Joe figures out that since Will charges people a fee before he meets them, that Will must have charged this guy a fee and just never given it back. And that's what Jasper wants. So Will lets him know that he owes him $3,000, and Joe doesn't exactly have that, but what he does have is a particular set of skills. And while this isn't the movie Taken, he uses those skills to forge a book and sell it to a rare LA bookstore and get $3,000 for it. So now Joe has the $3,000 for when he does run into Jasper, he's prepared to pay him off and get him to go away. But the relationship between him and Love has been going quite well. She's inviting him out to do different things, and one of those things is to help her pick some fish from the market. And since there's no better romantic place than the smell of fish at 5:30 in the morning, that's where the two share their first kiss. And it was actually Love who initiated it. And Joe is a little taken aback when she does this. And one of the reasons why is because he's seeing the ghost of Guinevere Beck just like he saw the ghost of Candace. The two head off to work, where later that day Jasper comes looking for Joe. And Jasper looks like a really nice guy, like an unassuming manager at a Sam Goody, or maybe a Radio Shack. So Joe gives him his $3,000, but Jasper says, okay, but where's the rest? You owe me $50. And Joe reassures him, yeah, okay, I can get it to you later today, although he's completely shocked by that amount of money. Joe just figures it'll buy him some time. Jasper says, yep, no problem. By the way, I have something else to show you. And then he grabs his hand and just casually cuts off his finger. Jasper puts the cut off finger in a Ziploc bag with ice and says, okay, you got about 12 hours to get this thing reattached. So as soon as you get me my money, I'll give you your finger back. And that's why you don't mess with people on the dark web, folks. So Joe has a very bloody hand and about 12 hours to get that finger back, but he has to figure out where this $50,000 is. So he heads to talk to Will, but Will isn't looking so great because Will told Joe, I need my meds, but Joe didn't believe it. And now Joe's realizing that he wasn't full of shit. Will tells him, I spent that $50,000, but there is a guy named Rufus, and he owes me $50,000. So just use this code word and he'll set you up with the money. So Joe does that, and Rufus gets back to him and gives him a time to come over. But unfortunately for Joe, that's going to interfere with a lunch date that Joe and Love had with her friends. Joe ends up giving her the excuse that he has to cancel because 40 is sending him somewhere to get something, but Love thinks that that's bullshit. And while Joe can't exactly go to the lunch, that doesn't mean he can't stop by. So he camps out and he's spying on her friends and the lunch date. And through Facebook and Instagram, he figures out who they all are. She met her friend Lucy at an LGBTQ rights protest. At the time, she was an intern, but she's gone on to become a very successful agent. The other one's named Sunrise, and that's her partner, and she's just a stay-at-home mom who takes care of their kid. And the final one is named Gabe, who is a pansexual massage therapist. We'll call it that, but he is Love's best friend. And immediately Joe thinks that this group of friends has the same motives that Beck's group of friends had, so he hates them. He's listening in on their conversation, and Love says, I kissed Joe, but I don't think he really liked it. And Lucy says, well, if he didn't like it, then fuck him. But Sunrise says, wait, it just might have taken him off guard a little bit. But Gabe reminds her that the most important thing is maybe she's finally back in the game after the death of her husband. And she admits that, yeah, you know, it's really the first time that she finds herself just casually through the day missing Joe. And she admits that she barely knows this guy, but he keeps popping into her head. And her friends are thrilled for her, and she admits that, yeah, I think I'm falling for this guy. And upon hearing this conversation, Joe takes back every bad thought he had about her friends. But at this point, he needs to get over to Rufus's house to get the money. And upon arriving, he realizes that this is going to be a little more difficult because Rufus is having a party at noon on a Tuesday. And since he doesn't know what Rufus looks like, he's texting him, but Rufus isn't getting back to him. And as he's trying to figure out who Rufus is, he notices that there's a celebrity in the room that he actually saw when he arrived in Los Angeles at the airport. And through a quick search, he finds out that it's a comedian named Hendy. He also runs into his neighbor Delilah, the gossip blogger. And Delilah is not too thrilled to see Hendy when he comes over. They start chatting a little bit, and when he sees Joe and sees the hand, he tells him, yeah, go over to the hospital, drop my name to the doctor, and they'll get you in right away. And Joe thinks that this guy is great, but it really pisses off Delilah for whatever reason. And because of it, she's now unwilling to help him find Rufus. But luckily, he does find Rufus, and Rufus gives him the package, but when Joe opens it, it's not money, it's just a bunch of pills. Because Will was getting his medicine from Rufus. So Joe heads back to the cage and gives Will his medicine, but Will is unwilling to take it. And at this point, Joe is fed up, and he screams at him, you better take that medicine because I could easily just hand you off to Rufus, and it would make my life a lot easier. So with the clock ticking, he heads home to try to figure out what to do, and as he's taking care of his hand, he gets a knock at the door, and it's Love. And this could not come at a worse time. And she wants to know why he lied to her and gave her an excuse about why they couldn't meet for lunch. And she knew he was lying the whole time because 40 is her twin brother, and he tells her everything. And Joe keeps making making excuses after excuses like, I don't really know you and you don't really know me, to the point where finally she says, does this have to do with your ex? And even though it absolutely does, Joe says no. She looks at him and says, I can tell that this girl did a number on you. I understand because mine did a number on me. So if anybody understands what Joe's going through, it would be love. But while she's talking, he sees Beck over the corner of her shoulder and he just screams at her to stop talking. She's pretty taken aback and says, I actually liked you. And then she just leaves. And maybe it's because of the loss of blood or the fact that he's just batshit insane anyway, but he has a long conversation with Beck. Or at least the ghost of Beck. And they're arguing about the motives in their relationship and maybe the motives in this new relationship. But he has to cut that fake conversation off because he needs to get his finger back. So he texts Jasper and the two meet up at the storage facility. And upon opening the door, he shows him the real Will and says, look, I'm not Will. That's the real Will right there. And Jasper isn't surprised at all. He's more impressed than anything. But when Joe says, look, there he is, you can take him, go ahead, Jasper pulls out the knife and says, really, you don't have the 50 grand. And when Jasper comes at him, Will ends up stabbing him first and killing him. The whole time, the real Will is just passed out in the corner. He also has another conversation with the ghost of Beck where she says, you're not scared of love hurting you, you're scared of hurting love. And there's probably a lot of truth in that. He wraps up Jasper's body in a tarp and then heads to the hospital to get his finger reattached. And then after that, he heads to Anavrin to start dismembering the body. He puts his body parts through the meat grinder at Anavrin and then disposes of it in a dumpster. I mean, this has got to be the biggest health code violation there is. As soon as he's done getting rid of the body, he texts Love and heads over to her apartment. And he admits that while he enjoyed kissing her, he can't have what he wants right now, which is love. And most of it has to do with the ex-relationship. He also admits that it's not that she did a number on him, it's that he did a number on her. And Love reassures him that I can't be hurt. Even with those comforting words, Joe is pretty worried that he can in fact hurt her, but they agree to start this thing off slow and even decide to start calling it a friendship, not a relationship. The next day, Joe is doing laundry at his place and in walks Delilah. He apologizes for whatever it is he said that was wrong, and she says, no, you just got caught up in the crossfire. She tells him the story that when she was 17, her and Hendy were friends, but when she went over to his house one night and had like 3 sips of beer, she woke up at 10 o'clock not remembering a thing, and her skirt was pulled up. And yeah, maybe it just happened to be that her skirt was pulled up, but it's more likely that he raped her. Joe asked if she ever tried to talk to anybody about this, and she said, yeah, but nobody will go on the record because they're all minors and they all look like me, non-white. So no one's going to believe them and everyone's going to tear them apart. All the while, Joe is giving this reassuring look, and she says, you're sitting there telling me that you care, but you're no different than them. You act nice because you're not. And I don't know what kind of bad you are, but I got my radar the hard way, so stay the fuck away from me and my sister. And even though Joe's in a new city, he decides to start a new creeper box. And the first thing he adds to it are stolen panties from Love's place. Some guys just never learn. In episode 3, Joe is sticking to this friendship. He doesn't want to mess it up. And Love Quinn is leaving little treats in his locker for him every day, and he's loving it, but she's getting frustrated. Because even with his persistent flirting with him, he still doesn't act on anything. And that's frustrating for her. So when she goes to meet with her 2 friends, Lucy and Sunrise, they let her know some exciting news. They've planned a date for their wedding, and she begs to make their cake. And after a little convincing, they accept the offer. But they know there's something up with her because she cooks when she's happy and she bakes when she's mad and frustrated. And it doesn't take long for them to figure out that this has to do with, quote, Will Biddleheim. And while Love has her 2 friends to vent to, Joe doesn't have anybody to vent to except for the real Will Biddleheim. And in fact, he actually loves it. He loves playing Dr. Phil to Joe. But Joe needs to get to work, and that day he's approached by 40, and the whole time he's waiting for that, hey, what are you doing with my sister talk? But it never comes, because 40's too busy bragging about his IMDb account. And the whole conversation is so vapid to Will, but he knows to get in good with Love, he's gonna have to befriend 40. So when 40 invites Joe to this sketch comedy show that Joe really doesn't want to go to, he acts stoked to get the invite and accepts. And 40 is going to this thing to scout some talent for this project that he's working on. So the two head to the sketch comedy show, and the whole time Joe is just picking apart these people, figuring out that they're Starbucks baristas clinging to the hope of fame. And he even notices that 40 isn't even paying attention. He keeps looking around the room. But then he figures out why, because when the show ends, there's a special guest spot from the comedian Henderson. And 40 tells Joe that the two go way back and that the thing that he's writing for him would be perfect for him and he can't wait to pitch it to him. But all Joe can think about is Delilah's story. So right after the show, 40 goes to pitch his idea to Henderson, but Henderson's in VIP. And when 40 goes to get into VIP, he's stopped by the bouncer. The guy tells him there's no way you're getting in here, not after the stunt you pulled the last time you talked to Henderson. And as 40 is pleading his case to get in, the manager lets a 15-year-old walk by, and when 40 brings that up, the 15-year-old turns around, flips him off, and that's when Joe sees that it's Ellie. And now he's concerned for Ellie because she's hanging out with Henderson. So when 40 says, yeah, let's get out of here, Joe doesn't. He stays to make sure that Ellie gets home okay. And Henderson does offer to give Ellie a ride home, but she says, no, I only live a few blocks away. And as soon as his car leaves, that's when Joe swoops in to see what's going on. And when Joe goes up to Ellie, the first thing she says is, did my sister put you up to this? But Will is simply concerned about Ellie and Henderson. And Ellie turns it around and causes a big scene to the point where Will just says, you know what, I'm just going to go home. I'll let your sister deal with the parenting. But before he goes home, he has to run dinner over to the real Will Biddleheim, and Will just loves seeing him. And you find out through their conversation that night that Will is engaged to a girl in the Philippines who he's never met. And that's who he sent the $50,000 to. And he's hoping that one day he can meet her, but he's also encouraging Will to continue his relationship with Love. And the next day at work, when Joe sees Love, he says, I'm already salivating, thinking about what she left in his locker. But when he opens it, there's nothing. And then he notices that Love was a little short with him when he saw her. He turns around and she says, I'm sorry, were you expecting something? And it's one of those conversations where anything he said, she was going to take offense to. Joe knows this and immediately goes and apologizes for whatever he did, but Love just doesn't really want to hear it. Now, 40, on the other hand, was watching this interaction go down, and that's when he decides to go have the what are you doing with my sister talk with Joe. But Joe reassures him, we're just friends, and in fact, I'm kind of just working on myself at the moment. And since 40's a recovering alcoholic, he asks, hey, are you in a program? Actually, you don't have to answer that. Just because I'm open with myself doesn't mean you have to be. But Joe ends up turning the conversation back to Love and asks him, did you notice that she's acting weird? And 40 says, I wouldn't sweat it. I mean, she's a little wound up lately, but she's always baking. And what do you bake for the baker? And that's when it dawns on Joe that this friendship has been a one-way street, and Joe needs to bake something for Love so she knows that he appreciates all that she's done for him. And when he returns home, he hears a commotion outside, and it's Delilah and Ellie arguing about Ellie's relationship with Hendy. And Delilah's obviously urging Ellie not to hang out with him, but Ellie's take is you blow everything out of proportion, and in her defense, Delilah's never told her exactly what happened between Henry and Delilah. And at one point, Ellie asks, did you send Will to follow me? And Delilah says, no, I got a tip from somebody at the bar. But when Ellie leaves, Delilah storms into Joe's apartment, demanding why Joe didn't tell her that Ellie was at the bar that night. And Joe says, well, she said it was an internship, and I was trying to avoid this exact conversation that we're having right now. And Delilah is just frustrated and vowing to take Henderson down, and he says, are you close to it? And she says how she's so close to being able to publish this story. And Joe asks, well, can I do anything to help? And she says, yes, stay out of the way and let me take down the bad guy. But it's kind of hard for Will to stay out of it, because when he gave Ellie that new cell phone, he put spyware on it just in case so that he can quote-unquote protect her. And he uses that spyware to see Ellie's text messages with Henderson, and in all honesty, they're pretty innocent. And that night he's hosting Ellie at a movie screening at his house, and Joe is like, great, because Love is coming over and he wants to devote all his attention to her. And that night, Love comes over, and Joe doesn't exactly make her something. He gives her something from her childhood that she used to eat, and she loves it. And she gets up at one point and kisses Joe, but Joe pulls back. Because Joe is staying steadfast to being friends, he really doesn't want to hurt Love. But he doesn't realize that he's also sending her mixed signals, and she's getting annoyed by this. And what started off as a nice night for the two just ends in a disaster. When Love leaves, she leaves the door open, and Joe goes to close it, but he hears somebody throwing up outside, and when he goes to investigate, he sees that it's Ellie. Ellie claims that she went over to Henderson's and ate an edible that was bad by accident. She doesn't exactly remember what happened, but Henderson was really nice and paid for her Uber ride home. Joe tries to clarify and says, wait, you lost track of time? And she says, don't even start with that crap. Don't be my sister. And by the way, please, God, do not tell my sister. Ellie makes him swear that he will not tell Delilah. And he does that, but now he needs to take the parenting into his own hands. So he heads to the real Will Biddleheim and asks if there's a way to hack into Henderson's cloud account to find dirt on him. And Will explains that after all those celebrities got hacked in 2014, they don't keep anything on the cloud, and you have to find his fake laptop, which is probably in his house. So with a quick Google search, Joe finds out where Henderson lives, but the problem is there's a gate and big walls. So now he needs to find a way to get in. And Joe realizes that breaking in might not be the best idea, so he wants to befriend somebody that Hendy is close to. He searches through his Instagram and finds some guy that was at that sketch comedy show, and he goes to the show, and afterwards he just showers praise on this guy, saying that he knows Hendy. And within about 5 minutes, the guy invites him to Hendy's party and gives him the code to get in. But when he heads over to the after party, he runs into 40, who doesn't have the code but wants to get in to pitch this idea to Hendy. And Joe's kind of in between a rock and a hard place and lets him in, even though he knows that going to a party might not be best for him, but 40's a big boy. And at the party, 40 runs into Henderson's agent, and he tries to set up a meeting to pitch this new idea that would be perfect for Henderson, but she gives him a cold dose of reality. She tells him, you know when people say that it factor, you don't have it. You don't have talent, you don't have motivation, but what you do have is money. So go take your money and go finance films. You'd be best at that. And I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but somebody had to. You're not going to make it. And I'm only telling you because I care about you. And that's probably the worst thing to say to a recovering addict, because this party is full of vices. And as Joe is searching the house to find the laptop, which he ends up finding, he comes downstairs to find 40 messed up on drugs, alcohol, both. We don't really know. And he's pitching this idea for Hendy to the entire room. And short of getting caught, this is Joe's worst nightmare, so he immediately texts Love saying what's going on, and she says, you gotta get him out of there. But when Joe tries to get 40 out of there, he resists. It actually takes Henderson talking him down to leave. But Henderson doesn't want to make him feel bad about leaving, so he actually just kills his entire party and says, you know what, I'm tired, I'm going to bed, everybody's gotta go. 40 keeps apologizing to him, but Henderson says, look, man, bygones are bygones. Don't even worry about it. Just get home safely. And when Joe tries to do that, Henderson catches him out of his eye and says, hey, man, do I even know you? Says, yeah, we met at that party. And he goes, you're right. And then they have an awkward conversation about Delilah and Ellie. But Joe is able to get 40 back to his apartment, and Love comes over to take care of him. 40 starts apologizing to Love and then asks her, do you think I'm talented? And she says, yeah, that's why I push you so much. Eventually, though, he falls asleep, and she goes outside to explain to Joe exactly what's wrong with 40. She says he used to be a really good kid, really happy, but then one summer, their parents stuck them with this weird au pair that showed 40 a lot of shit he shouldn't have seen. And ever since that day, he's just kind of been fucked up. He never really had a chance. He's broken. But you know what? I'm broken. We're all a little broken. And as Love is pouring her heart out to Joe, he decides, all right, friendship's over, and the two start making out. They make their way into the house, then they make their way into the bedroom, and then their clothes make their way off their bodies. And this girl is a freak in the sheets in the best way possible. And even though she tries to be quiet, they're not that quiet, and 40 hears the whole thing go down from outside. As Joe makes his way out of the bedroom that morning, he realizes that he can change with Love, and that the past doesn't have to repeat itself, and that this time things will be different. But he also realizes that he's kind of in a throuple now with Love and 40. But he still has to deal with the whole Henderson situation. So he heads to the cage where the real Will Biddleheim has been trying to crack Hendy's computer, and he lets him know it was easy to crack, but unfortunately, it's clean. So at this point, with everything that he's seen, and now with this evidence that the computer's clean, he's thinking, maybe Henderson isn't that bad of a guy. So Joe heads off to work, and at work he sees 40, and 40 lets him know that he has a meeting on the books with Hendy, but that original thing he was going to pitch him probably isn't the best. So he wants to sit down with Joe because he loves the way that Joe's mind works. He thinks it's perfect for script writing. And as the two are discussing this, Joe says, hey, you don't have to tell me, but what exactly happened between you and Henderson? And 40's a little embarrassed and says, honestly, I have no idea. I had so much stuff in my system, but apparently I threw up all over his toy room. Joe says, toy room? He says, yeah, that house is an old speakeasy house. It's a secret room where he keeps all his toys. Like, imagine a bunch of kid stuff for a sadist. It's kind of creepy. And Joe really wishes he knew about that secret room. In episode 4, we get more backstory on Joe's childhood. His dad would beat him, but his mother was a philanderer, and an overall pretty shitty mom. She would go cheat on his dad and leave him in a grocery store for hours. And then when they would get back, the dad would want to know where they were, and he would go to Joe. But Joe would keep his mom's secret and just endure the abuse. His mother would then patch up the wounds and one time said, you know what? One of these days, I'm going to kill that guy. And that probably explains why Joe's so fucked up. But in present day, Joe's relationship with Love is going great. Everything that would have annoyed him in the past with a relationship like Beck or Candace isn't annoying him anymore. Such as her brother 40 texting him to collaborate on a writing project because he loves the way that Joe thinks. But when he's about to text 40 back, Love says, hey, when you text him back, don't tell him about us. Anytime I start seeing somebody, he gets really jealous and territorial, so just don't mention it. We'll wait a couple weeks before we let the cat out of the bag. But 40's persistence pays off, and Love and Joe cancel their plans for the weekend so Joe can help 40. But before he helps 40, he needs to do laundry, and as he's doing so, Delilah comes bursting downstairs, demanding to know what Ellie is doing. She says she's doing a project, but it is not for Henderson. She's no longer hanging out with him. He just simply drinks too much. But when Delilah leaves the room, Joe overhears a conversation between Ellie and her friend that Ellie caught the spyware that Delilah put on her phone. The friend says, are you sure it was her? And she says, well, who else would it possibly be? I'm not even going to tell her. It's best that she actually thinks that we're no longer talking. But of course, it wasn't Delilah that put the spyware on her phone. It was Joe, and Joe is hearing all of this. Luckily, Joe kept Hendy's laptop, and he never unconnected iMessages, and he can still see all their text messages. And while he could tell Delilah, he could also just take care of it himself. And since Henderson is out of town, this is the perfect time to get back in the house and find that room. But he doesn't want to break in, and he needs help from the real Will Biddleheim. He tells Will that he does actually want to let him go, because deep down he knows to have a relationship with Love, he's going to have to let this guy out of the cage. So he tells Will, if you can figure out a way that you can promise me that you will not tell the police, I'll let you go. But in the meantime, I need help getting into this guy's house. So thanks to Google Maps, they see the security sign outside of Henderson's house, and Will is able to figure out what frequency they need to jam. And sure enough, Joe goes to buy a frequency jammer, and it works. He's in. He finds the kink room hidden behind a bookshelf, and it's as creepy as it sounds. It's also very clean, though, because there's a Roomba down there. But when the Roomba knocks into the fireplace, he sees a loose tile. And when he pulls that tile, he sees a cigar box inside. And when he looks in the cigar box, there's a bunch of pictures of girls knocked out with their clothes kind of ripped off that he took. And one of those pictures is, in fact, Delilah. So he takes those pictures and leaves them in an unmarked envelope under Delilah's door so that she can break open this story. After he goes all true detective, he heads on over to Anavern to meet Love for brunch. But it's not just Love, it's Love and all of her friends. And this is another example of something that would have annoyed him with Beck, but he doesn't mind talking to her friends, even though he doesn't understand anything they're talking about. And Love surprised Joe with their friends because she didn't want to tell him that they were coming, because she admits that if it were her, she would end up looking them up on social media just like Joe did. Now, the group is having fun until they're interrupted by 40, who shows up pissed off that he wasn't invited to their, quote, coming out party. He's supposed to have a big meeting on the books today with a producer, but now he can't even focus because he's so mad. He lets him know, I knew you guys were fooling around this entire time, but the fact you couldn't even tell me hurts me. 40 proceeds to throw a temper tantrum and just leaves. That night, Joe's hanging out with Love, and she's baking her heart out, concerned about 40 because he's not getting back to her. And Joe thinks that the two need boundaries, but he also doesn't think it's his place to probably say it. So he comes up with another solution. Let's include him in a brunch. Let's include him in a beach day. Let's just include him in our lives. And Love loves the idea, and it brings down her anxiety a bit. The next morning, Will is woken up by 40 and Love is cutting 40's hair, and 40 is in a much better mood today. He apologizes for the way he acted, but also says that he ended up canceling that lunch, and he's going to meet with that producer after the producer returns from South by Southwest, so he can continue to brainstorm with Joe if Joe's up for it. And of course, Joe says yes, but he doesn't really want to. But 40 needs a new suit for the meeting and needs Love to help him pick one out. And he only wants Love. He doesn't want Joe. The problem is Joe and Love have made plans that day, and 40 basically makes them cancel the plans. And this is really the first time where Joe's been pissed off at something that 40 or her friends have done in the relationship. But there's not much that he can do about it. So after they leave, Joe heads downstairs and overhears Ellie and her friend. And Ellie says to her friend, hey, text me to ask me to sleep over tonight so I have a built-in excuse for Delilah. Henderson's throwing a movie screening and I'm going to go to it at his house. And Joe is wondering why Hendy is still walking around and not in handcuffs after he gave Delilah the pictures. He sees Delilah in the basement and gingerly starts asking about the situation, saying that he saw some girl drop the pictures off. And Delilah says that she gave them to a cop friend, but the cop friend said there's not much that they can do because Henderson isn't in any of the pictures. It's a very generic background in all the pictures. They didn't find them on Henderson. They didn't find him in his house. And really, whoever took these pictures kind of screwed her over because there's nothing the cops can actually do with them. And all Delilah can really do is hide those pictures in her house until somebody breaks the story and then she could pull them out. And Joe feels really guilty about this and he's trying to figure out a way to make it right, but he gets a text message from 40 asking about writing and he completely forgot about it and has to put the Delilah situation on the back burner. So he heads on over to a Navern to help 40 write, and he's basically telling 40 anything he wants to hear to get out of this writing session. He goes as far as to tell 40 he's a genius, and 40 thinks, well, that's great. We should just continue to write all night, but Joe says, no, we shouldn't. You know what you should do? You should go to South by Southwest, and you should find that producer and pitch him this idea because it's that good. And in reality, Joe doesn't think it's that good. He just wants to get out of there. But luckily for Joe, 40 loves this idea and heads off to South by Southwest, which frees up Joe to devote his time to the Henderson situation. So Joe hits the storage locker to get some supplies, and the real Will Biddleheim is wondering what he's doing because he's actually worried that Joe is going to kill somebody. And whether he's just trying to appease Joe or he actually believes it, he says, I don't think you're a murderer because I've dealt with people on the dark web, I've dealt with some shady individuals, and you're just not that. Deep down, I think you're actually a good person. And Joe is wondering if Will is feeding him a line or not, but then Joe thinks maybe I really have changed. As he's leaving the storage facility, he gets a frantic call from Love saying, did you tell 40 he should go to South by Southwest? Joe explains, well, yeah, kind of. And Love is pissed off because now Love has to go to South by Southwest to be his, quote, sober companion. And that's not at all what Joe wanted. But at the moment, he needs to focus on taking Henderson down. He breaks into Hendy's house and sees Ellie knock on the door, and Hendy explains, look, all the people that were going to come, they all kind of called out sick. And Ellie asks him, well, will you finally look at my short film? And Hendy plays the anti-pervert. He says, no, that'd be weird if an underage girl is here with me alone in my house. But after Ellie insists, he, quote, begrudgingly lets her in. The two watch the film and Hendy loves it, and then Ellie wants to give him a pitch, but Hendy says, I never listen to a pitch without a drink. Do you want something? And Joe watches Hendy pour her a drink and then roofie that drink. So Joe needs to think fast, and he creates a diversion by throwing a salt shaker, get Hendy out of the room, and then he walks over to Hendy's drink and roofies the shit out of that. And this causes Hendy to get knocked out before Ellie. Now, it's not like Ellie doesn't end up falling asleep, but it gives Will enough time to get Henderson down to the dungeon, strap him up, and get a confession out of him. He wakes up Henderson by blasting some music, and all the while, Henderson is blindfolded so he can't see what Joe looks like. And Joe is telling him that he wants a confession. He starts cutting up his arms a little bit because pain causes truth, and Henderson gives in. All right, I'll confess. Joe puts on a Henderson mask to cover his own face and takes the blindfold off of Henderson and starts to film this, quote, confession. But Henderson plays the victim. He says he was abused as a child, and that's probably where it stems from. And Joe is getting more and more pissed off. Joe almost blows a gasket when Henderson says, well, that's probably what happened with you, right? I mean, we're all a little fucked up inside. That's probably what happened with you. And it pisses off Joe so much that he rips the Henderson mask off his face and screams at him, I'm nothing like you. But then Joe realized he just fucked up because Henderson knows who he is. Henderson immediately says, wait, you were at the party. You were trying to be the hero, and now you're trying to be the hero now. Henderson then makes a break for it, but Joe fights him off on the steps and throws him down the stairs, and Henderson cracks his head on the back of the wall, and Joe knows, oh my God, he's dead. And Joe is kind of shocked because he thought he had changed, but then he just says, look, this is nothing more than an accident. Accidents happen. And as he's standing there looking at the body, trying to figure out what to do with it, blood from his nose drips onto the floor. And now he's got another issue because he's got to clean up the DNA. So he goes upstairs and grabs some cleaning supplies, but when he drops a bucket, it wakes up Ellie. He pulls out his phone real quick to distract her, saying that your sister's looking for you, and she's pretty pissed off, and Ellie gets out of there. When Joe gets downstairs, that Roomba, though, has smeared up Joe's blood and Hendy's blood, and now he needs to get rid of everything. So he carefully cleans up the spots, throws the Roomba, the bloody rags, and for some reason Henderson's headphones into a trash bag, and figures that the cops will think that Henderson slit his wrist, thought better of it, went upstairs, passed out, fell back, cracked his head, and it was a suicide. When Joe gets home that night, he has that trash bag in his hand, and as he's crossing the street, he gets stopped by that cop that knows Delilah. And the cop is about to arrest him for jaywalking and wants to know what's in the bag, and this is the moment where Joe thinks, all right, the jig is up, I'm going to get caught. But the first thing that the cop pulls out is those headphones. And Joe says, look, I was just going to donate them to Goodwill, but if you want them, you can have them. So the cop takes the headphones, gives the trash bag back to Joe, and says, I was going to write you up for jaywalking, but just go home. So somehow, Joe once again dodged a bullet. And at this point, Joe really thinks that this is a fresh start in Los Angeles. So he goes to the real Will Biddleheim and brings him everything he would need to create a fake identity, and he lets him out. He makes Will promise not to tell the cops and tells him to go to Manila, be with the fiancé you've never met, but just go. And he knows that this might be the stupidest thing he's ever done, but he also knows to have an actual future with love, he can't have a guy living in a storage facility in a cage. But down in Austin at South by Southwest, right before 40 and Love are about to go into a screening, 40 mentions to Love that he's met a new girl, and it's like love at first sight. When the new girl walks over, it's Candace, and she's saying her name is Amy. In episode 5, Joe is at the meet your parents stage of the relationship, as Love's parents are planning on renewing their vows this weekend in an entire weekend-long celebration. And this thing is like 90% hippie retreat with 10% wedding vow renewal. And while Joe is kind of looking forward to it, Love is absolutely dreading it. And Joe would probably dread it too if he knew that Candace was coming along. He just thinks that 40's new girlfriend is coming along. Love is also concerned for 40, however, because 40's had relationships before, and he's worried that this new girl is nothing more than a gold digger. She's also worried that 40 will end up relapsing and causing a scene. As Joe's leaving for the weekend, he sees that there's 2 police detectives that Delilah is asking to talk to Ellie, because they know from text messages that Ellie was hanging out with Henderson the night he died. And while they still think it's a suicide, they're just covering all their bases. Delilah plays it off like she's a ditzy blonde and says Ellie's not here right now, but when she goes inside, she goes right at Ellie. But Ellie confronts her because Ellie has found the pictures that Joe gave her and wants to know, what the hell are these? And Delilah says, okay, if you want to know what they really are, they're Hendersons. Ellie still doesn't believe it, but she says, well, the reason I know they're Hendersons is because it happened to me. But Ellie is having a hard time accepting that her friend could ever possibly do this. But at the moment, that's not Will's problem, and he heads on up to the wedding vow renewal with Love, and there are a ton of people there, including most of her friends. And of course, one of the people that's there is 40's new girlfriend, Candace, or Amy as they're referring to her. And Joe is absolutely floored. Joe is able to quickly get her alone, and she says, I bet you want to figure out how I tracked you down. Well, it's funny. I was sitting there feeling pretty shitty, but I saw a clickbait article about how the stars live, and they just kept mentioning Henderson's parties. And then I saw this video of this idiot standing on a coffee table making a pitch. And in the very background of that video, I saw Joe Goldberg. So I ended up tracking down that idiot and making him fall in love with me, which wasn't hard to do. And now I'm able to protect this family from you. But Joe thinks that she is batshit insane. And she's having to take matters in her own hands instead of going to the police, because when Joe grabbed her, Joe took her to the woods tied up to save their relationship. But when Candace got away, Joe chased after her and tackled her on the ground. And as Candace was trying to get away, Joe was covering her mouth saying, please stop, please stop, please stop. And he bashed her head against a rock. He didn't mean to do it as hard as he did, but he thought she was dead and he buried her alive. When she came to, she crawled out of that ditch and went to the cops, but because there was really no evidence, the cops couldn't do much. And she couldn't believe it because this guy just tried to murder her, but the best they could do was a restraining order for the moment. The cop does give her some off-the-record advice saying, if this guy thinks you're dead, stay that way. But instead, Candace decided to track him down and try to make his life a living hell. So Joe knows he has to keep tabs on Candace, and he's trying to figure out what tent she's in because he doesn't want to walk into the wrong tent. But when he walks into one tent, he finds Love's mother smoking a joint. And while that really isn't Joe's thing, Love's mother insists, and they start smoking together. And Love's mom is being very inappropriate with how she's talking to Joe. Very sexually, and Joe figures it's a trap, so he just says, I want to let you know that your daughter is one of the most amazing people I've ever met. And Love's mom sits there for a little bit and says, you know what? You're good for Love. Now, while Joe is passing the parents' test, Candace is not. She's failing miserably. The next day, they're having this practice of everybody standing in a circle, and you go into the center of a circle and say what you want, and some stranger comes out and hugs you. And when Candace goes out in the middle of the circle and says her dream is to one day go to Italy, it's Joe who goes out to hug her, but she has a little PTSD and tries to pull back. Joe does end up getting that hug in, but Candace needs to go away. She can't take it. So Joe tracks her down into her tent, and Candace is standing there with a knife threatening to stab him if he comes any closer. But the way Candace is holding that knife, Joe knows he can easily get it from her, and he does. Joe tells her, you're not trying to protect these people. You just want to hurt me. So he gives her the knife and basically invites her to stab him. But since she's not a psychopath, she can't bring herself to do it. The two are interrupted by 40 and Love, who walk in, and they make an excuse that Candace needed some Claritin and Joe was giving it to her. And then Joe and 40 go off to talk to 40's dad. 40's dad had been blowing him off the entire weekend, and Love asks Joe if he can step in and try to help him out because their dad is just always a dick to him. So at this point, it's just Candace and Love in the same room together. And Candace lets Love know how her old boyfriend attacked her, but she doesn't mention Joe/Will. They then start talking about their careers and how 40 and Candace are going to start a production company, and they're going to start hiring some cinematographers, which Love thinks that's way too early to do. She then starts asking Candace about her career and her production, and does she know this person and that person, and she catches Candace in a lie, although she doesn't call her on it. But she is very suspicious of Candace and her motives. 40, however, goes to make that pitch to his dad, but his dad continues to blow him off. He just thinks he's a loser. He says, all right, how much are you going to want this time? Joe is eventually brought into the conversation and defends 40, saying the pitch is really good. I think it's worth it, even though he thinks the pitch is terrible. And 40 says, I just need $100,000 and that's it. I'm out of your hair. But his dad tells him, no, I'm not cutting any more checks. Go get a job and stop leeching off me. And 40 is really blown away and upset and is sick of the vegan lifestyle he's been living for the past couple days at this hippie retreat kind of thing and says, all right, let's go get a chalupa. When Joe returns, Love lets him know that I caught Candace in a lie and I'm kind of suspicious of her, and Joe says, yeah, me too. Let's get rid of her. But that's a little aggressive and the wrong thing to say, and Love has noticed that Joe has been acting weird the entire weekend, and he says, look, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's the fact I just had a chalupa and my stomach hurts. But Love cuts him off and says, you went to Taco Bell? And he says, yeah. He says, oh my God, I gotta find 40 because 40 always goes to Taco Bell before he relapses. The two have a little bit of a fight about the weekend, and Love goes off to find 40. Joe chases after her because he wants to help, but he gets a phone call from Delilah because the cop that Delilah knows came to her apartment looking for those pictures, but when Delilah went to the cabinet where she keeps them, she couldn't find them, and she knows that Ellie took them. So she calls up Joe asking, hey, are you with Ellie? And just says, no, but I have some text message from her. Let me see what she's up to. And he looks at her text messages and sees that she's at a movie theater and says, hey, check out this movie theater. They're having a movie marathon. Go there. So Joe hangs up the phone and finds Love and says, I'll go find 40. You go deal with your parents and their vows. And he does find 40. Unfortunately, he's in a tent smoking weed with some random guy. And Love is supposed to, I guess, officiate would be the word I would use. I don't really know. I've never done this before. The whole wedding vow situation with her parents, but she's distracted because of 40. But when Joe brings 40 back, her mind is put at ease. And she starts talking about her parents' love, but the more she talks, the more Joe realizes that she's not talking about her parents. She's talking about their relationship. And it's a really nice speech until 40 interrupts it. He makes a complete fool of himself and even reveals his crack pipe at one time. And it gets to the point where Love has to drag him away. 40 goes chasing after Love and finds Love, 40, and her mother in a tent together, and her mother is just coddling 40, saying how disappointed she is in Love because Love had one job to do, and that was to keep 40 safe. Love calls her mom a hypocrite, and her mother just slaps the shit out of her. Joe brings Love back to the tent and is telling her how, hey, my father used to beat me. And Love goes on to explain that when they were 13, their parents brought a Navarin, and they had that au pair manage the place, and that was 40's quote-unquote first love. But in reality, he didn't know he was being abused, and he still doesn't to this day. When their parents found out, they fired that girl and she committed suicide, and it was 40 who found the body, and that has traumatized them ever since. And their parents did what they always do. They paid for it to go away. The two continue the conversation, and they eventually tell each other they love each other, but since love is a complicated word, they want their own word, and they decide to say, I woof you, because of an incident that happened earlier in the day with a wolf. Later that night, Joe goes up to Candace alone and says, I'm not scared of you anymore, because if you had anything on me, you would have already gone to the cops. And Candace tells him, I don't need to go to the cops. I just need to wait for you to fuck up. And murder has a way of finding you. And then finally, there's the Delilah situation. Delilah was able to catch Ellie coming out of the movie theater and explains the cops need those photos because they can't figure out why Henderson killed himself, and those photos would implicate him. And Ellie admits that she now believes that Henderson did it and apologizes to her sister, but says, I think we should get rid of these photos because if you were one of those girls, would you really want this out there? In fact, you were one of these girls. Would you want your photos on the internet when it's searched? So the two end up cutting up the photographs and disposing of them. They never get them to the police. So when Joe gets back, he's trying to figure out what to do about the whole Candace situation, but he does return to a postcard from the real Will Biddleheim who made it to Manila. The next day to Navarin, Joe and Love are making out and they're interrupted by 40 saying stop with the PDA. And 40 lets him know that he's buying the option to this book that Candace gave him, and of course it is Guinevere Beck's book. And as 40 is explaining how the book really spoke to him, he gets an alert on his phone saying that the Henderson situation is now being looked at as a murder and not a suicide. And 40 is in complete shock as Candace just stares at Joe saying, murder has a way of following you. In episode 6, Joe and Love, 40, Candace, pretty much all of her friends attend Henny's funeral. But the only thing that Joe can focus on is how the hell Candace is still here. Which I guess is better than focusing on the fact that you're at a funeral for a guy you murdered. After the funeral, 40's feeling pretty emotional and tells Candace that he wants her to move out of that Airbnb and move into his place. But Love thinks it's way too early for that. But 40 just inadvertently told Joe that Candace is staying in a B&B, and now all Joe has to do is track it down and find her and get rid of her. At the funeral, Joe also sees Candace and the cop who stopped him for jaywalking, and because he's at the funeral of a guy he killed, he's very, very paranoid. But that certainly is not stopping his obsession with Candace, and when she leaves Navarin, Will follows her. But when he sees an unmarked police officer, he stops, and he ends up losing her tail. Joe turns around and heads back to his apartment where he sees Ellie, and she's doing a lot better, but Delilah is not. She's obsessed with taking down Henderson because now that he's a murder victim, he's become a martyr. Joe also realizes that while Ellie is putting on a facade, she's also having a tough time with this and needs someone in her life. So when she invites him to watch a movie, even though he's not a big movie guy, he agrees and puts the Candace thing on the back burner. The next day at work, 40 comes up to Joe and lets him know that they're going to set up shop in a production company in the back of a Navarin, and he's going to make Joe an executive producer along with Candace. He hands Joe a form to fill out to name his production company. It can be anything he wants, but on the production company form, he also sees Candace's name, but she hasn't put an address. So Joe asks, hey, I'll put my address here, but what's hers? But 40 doesn't actually know. He just knows the area that she lives in. That's all that Joe needs, though. He hops on Airbnb and figures out what house she probably would be renting from. Now, he's supposed to take a drive with Love to go get donuts, but he figures he can squeeze in time to go to this house, and he's standing outside of it waiting for Candace to come out, but he sees that same plainclothes officer show up, and he gets spooked and runs away. But he also didn't manage his time wisely because it made him an hour late to meet Love. And when he gets back to Navarin, he sees Love talking to that same plainclothes cop, and now he's convinced that he's going to be caught. So when he walks in there, he's very skittish. But Love isn't giving off the vibe of somebody who just found out that her boyfriend is a serial killer. Now, don't get me wrong, she's pissed, but Joe has to find out what was up with that guy and says, hey, when I walked in, you were talking to some guy. Who was that? Yeah, that's our family's private investigator. I hired him to tail Candace because I just don't trust her. Now, while Joe is relieved that he wasn't being followed, he thinks it's crazy that she's being so normal about this. I mean, she just hired a private investigator to follow her boyfriend's girlfriend. And now Joe's starting to think, could you have me followed? The beginning of a fight breaks out, but cooler heads prevail, and Love says, you know what, you're right, it is a little much. I'll call off the investigation tomorrow. But Joe and Love weren't the only ones keeping tabs, because Candace did the exact same thing Joe did. Candace took Joe's address, wrote it down, and went to his place and starts looking through the windows, but she's caught by Delilah. She explains that she's Joe's ex-girlfriend and she's just looking for a pair of earrings, and Delilah says, hey, don't I know you? I saw you at Henderson's funeral. Did you actually know him? And when Candace says, no, he wasn't really my type, it seems like his comedy was kind of creepy, Delilah suddenly is on board with helping her and goes into the apartment to see if she can find the earrings. She doesn't let Candace in, but while she's searching for those earrings, Candace sneaks in real quick, unlocks one of the windows, and sneaks out. Of course, Delilah doesn't find any earrings, but that's all that Candace needed. But unfortunately for Candace, the investigator saw all of this go down and calls Love up and says, hey, I think there's something you need to see. When Joe returns to the apartment that night, he's relieved that Love has called off the dogs, but he's greeted by Ellie, who is just impressed that he had not only Love Quinn, but this other redheaded girl that showed up today. And right away, Joe knows, oh my god, Candace was here. She's crossed the line. So Joe is done playing games at this point. He grabs some duct tape and rope and heads on over to Candace's Airbnb and breaks in, but when he does so, he's knocked out and tied up. And while he thinks it's Candace, it's not. It's actually the homeowner. She's supposed to be away in Germany according to the Airbnb site, but she's not. She's simply renting a room to Candace. And Joe talks his way out of it by saying it was like a rape fantasy situation, but while that was going on, Candace was going back to Joe's to sneak in. And when she opens up the window, she finds Love Quinn sitting there waiting for her. And immediately Candace says this isn't what it looks like, but Love has a folder with her true identity in it. And that's when Candace comes clean. The guy you're dating, the guy you know as Will, isn't named Will. His name is Joe, and he's my former boyfriend who attacked me. And I'm pretty sure he did it to another girl, and I came here to protect you and your family. But most importantly, I came here to protect you. And then she gives Love proof. So when Joe returns home, Candace is long gone, but Love is sitting there baking up some cinnamon buns. But when Joe goes to eat one, it tastes terrible because Love switched around the ingredients. And she says, yeah, no, it sucks to be lied to, doesn't it? Do you want to explain this? And she throws him an envelope that has a picture of Joe and Candace when they were dating. Love screams that Candace is claiming that you killed somebody and you killed another girl and you tried to kill her. And immediately he thinks fast and comes up with a story that Candace is crazy and he moved to Los Angeles and changed his name just to simply get away from her. He never tried to kill her. If so, the cops would have gotten him. And as for the other girl, he went on one date with Guinevere Beck and he thinks that she posted something on Instagram just to make her actual boyfriend jealous. But all of these fantasies are just made up in Candace's head. And that's one of the reasons he never had social media, because he never wanted her to find him. It seems like Love is actually buying this story, and Joe says, I've never loved anyone the way that I love you. And Love says, yeah, me too, which makes this even harder. We're done. And she breaks things off with Joe. And one of the reasons she broke things off with Joe is because the truth is such a big deal to Love Quinn. Her husband kept the fact that he was sick a secret for 2 months. But the reason he did so is to keep a little normalcy before life changed forever. The next day, Joe heads into the store and tries to give back his apron and quit, but 40 says, you don't have to quit. I talked to Love, and we just think you're punished enough at this point, but just stay away from her and stay out of her airspace. And Joe asks 40, why exactly are you doing this? And 40 says, well, while you did lie about your identity, and that's a pretty shitty thing to do, I do like having you around, and you're one of the more real people that I know. That night when Joe gets home, Ellie storms out of her apartment and says, would you please do something? And when Joe enters their apartment, Delilah is sitting there just combing over all this material trying to figure out this case. Joe is trying to talk her down a little bit, and the two end up having sex. And afterwards, Joe says, you know, you're trying to find the story, but the story is yours. So why don't you just write the story from your standpoint, and maybe it'll encourage other victims to come forward. And while that seems like a great idea, Delilah just looks at him and says, I don't need you mansplaining this. In episode 7, Joe is having a tough go with this relationship ending, and he starts to spy on Love, but when he does so, he sees a guy snooping around her apartment, and he grabs her spare key and walks in. Immediately, Joe tries to call Love, but figures, you know what, I better just head over there to see what's going on. But when he does so, he sees Love and this guy hooking up, and then he knows, oh my god, she's actually moved on. You find out that this guy's name's Milo, and 40 absolutely hates him because he was her ex-husband's best friend. But he had the hots for Love ever since college, and he was pissed when she picked her husband over him. And he even went so far as to, quote, comfort her after the funeral by giving her that good D. And Joe hops on Instagram and does a quick search and finds out that this guy is an Australian travel blogger who is sponsored by Patagonia, a company that coincidentally his father owns. And look, I'm a heterosexual male, but this dude is gorgeous. And he truly seems like the perfect guy that you really can't compete with. But even with all that, 40 reassures Joe that Love is not over you. Watch this. So he goes and grabs Love and pulls her aside and says, are you serious with this guy? Again? You can't be into him. And you're doing it in front of Joe. And she says, well, I am into him, and I don't really care if it's in front of Joe or Will or whatever you want to call him, so why don't you just worry about yourself? So 40 figures that Joe needs to make Love jealous at this point, and he suggests to hop on some online dating apps to do so. And Joe once again asks, dude, why are you doing this? I lied to your sister. He says, well, you did lie to my sister, and that was kind of shitty, but the lie was necessary because Candace was crazy. And something in my gut tells me that you're good and he's bad, so I'm Team Joe. And 40 isn't the only one who thinks he should hop on some online dating apps. Ellie also sends him a text message with a bunch of online dating apps that he should try, and the only one that seems to catch his eye is one for readers. But when he hops on it, he finds out that the online dating scene isn't all that great. He wasn't really connecting with any of these women. But Love doesn't need to know that the dates weren't going great, and 40 starts posting from his Instagram account pictures of Joe and other girls going on dates to make Love jealous. And it does in fact work. That is until Milo shows up with donuts that Love once described as so good they should be a sex crime. And Milo and Love start having a conversation, and Joe is overhearing the whole thing about how Milo was supposed to go away for 10 months, but he's sick of traveling. He doesn't want to do that. He wants to try to have a relationship with Love. And Love is a little taken aback and says, you need to think about this more, and if it feels right, then do it. But Joe, thinking he was getting rid of Milo, now needs to take it into his own hands. But before he can do that, he's at the register, and Love comes up and starts asking him about how the online dating scene's going. And she seems really supportive of it and seems happy for him, but then she asks, by the way, what name are you using, Will or Joe? And Joe is using the name Will. And that's when he realizes she's not happy for me, she's disgusted in me. So Joe realizes that the whole making her jealous thing isn't working, and he goes to take care of Milo, and he starts running on his trail. And anytime Joe Goldberg starts running on your trail, it's bad news for the person in front of him. But luckily for Milo, he's in too good of shape and Joe can't keep up. Joe does end up running into her friend Gabe, however, and he quickly makes up a lie like, oh, it's crazy seeing you here, I just saw Milo, but Gabe says, look man, cut the shit. What you did to Love was a pretty shitty thing. because Love values truth more than anything else. And the reason she likes Milo is because he worked on himself. But I'll tell you right now, the way she talked about you, she has never talked about a guy like that ever, including her dead husband. So why don't we go try to work on yourself? So Joe follows Gabe and they do this holistic / spiritualistic / acupuncture therapy. And Gabe keeps asking Joe what he's scared of. And whatever is in those acupuncture needles brings up the memory of Joe when he was a kid and his mother trying to leave his dad. His mother told him, I'll be back at 4 o'clock to pick you up. It'll be just me and you. We're finally getting out of here. But when she showed up, she had yet another guy. And Joe didn't want to get into a car with some stranger and his mom. He just wanted to be with his mom. And because of that memory, Joe starts bawling his eyes out. And Gabe says, you've been striving to have somebody else love you, but maybe your love is all you ever needed. And it gets to the point where Joe actually looks at Gabe and says, oh my God, you're a wizard. Because he truly has had a breakthrough. Now, Gabe also suggests he does a 7-day celery cleanse, and since the therapy works so great, he goes with it. And as he's sitting there drinking celery with 40, in walks Ellie looking to, quote, check up on her neighbor, but in reality, she's looking for another internship because she saw that 40 bought the option for Guinevere's book. And after a little bit of pleading, Joe says, yeah, okay, as long as we get written permission from Delilah and all your schoolwork's done. Love, on the other hand, that night has a date with Milo, and Milo lets her know that he's decided to move to Los Angeles and even has found a place. He's not going away for 10 months. But Love kind of likes their current arrangement, which is basically when she breaks up with a guy, he shows up and the two are fuck buddies for a little bit. But Milo doesn't want that because Milo is truly falling in love with her. But Love reminds him that I'm a package deal. It's me and 40. And it's no secret that the two really don't get along. And Milo says he's a grown man, but Love cuts him off and says, you know he's not, though. And it's only a matter of time before the movie he's working on fails and I have to be there to pick up the pieces. But Milo is frustrated because he wants a future with Love and only Love. And he feels like 40 is constantly in the way of her moving on. Now, during that same dinner, Joe is at his house continuing his juice cleanse, and he gets a knock on the door from Delilah. And Delilah lets him know that she wrote that story about what happened to her in Henderson, and it's being published in Variety. But before Joe can even really congratulate her, he pukes all over her exorcist style and passes out. When he wakes up, he wants to know what happened, and Delilah says, well, you threw up on me. Same thing happened to me, actually. I found out that celery was a negative calorie, and I did the same thing and puked all over my birthday cake. She orders the two food that night, and they sit there, and Joe's reading her story, and he really likes it, but they want to go out and get more alcohol. And as they're walking away from the liquor store, they're discussing their first impressions of each other. This leads to them making out, then it leads to public sex, and then it leads to them getting arrested for having sex in public. And Joe is really concerned that they're going to take fingerprints and figure out that he is not actually the real Will Biddleheim. In fact, he is Joe Goldberg. Delilah, on the other hand, is trying to find her cop friend, but the cop friend does show up, although he's not interested in helping her out, because he was hooking up with Delilah, and when he found out Delilah got caught having sex in public with another guy, the favors kind of went out the window. But Will calls up 40, and 40 calls in some favors and gets them out of there. And as Will is walking out, the cop looks at him and says, hey, don't I know you? And Delilah cuts in and says, yeah, he's my neighbor. You probably saw him around the building. So when Delilah and Joe get back, they both agree that it's probably for the best they just remain friends. And as Delilah is hugging Joe, Ellie shows up and sees it and says, Jesus, why do you have to be such a slut? At this point, though, Joe needs to go to work. As 40 is razzing Joe about getting caught having sex in public, Milo shows up to give Love some roses. And Love hates roses. And 40 says, it's like this guy isn't even trying, yet he's still trying too hard. As Milo is leaving, 40 once again insults him, and at this point, Milo's had enough and goes back at him. And 40's pissed that this guy's continuing to show up every time she has a breakup, and Milo thinks that 40 is holding her back. The two end up having a heated argument, and when 40 says, how do you think your best friend would feel as he watches from heaven you finger bang his wife because you can't get it up? Milo punches him in the face. At this point, Love comes out and tells Milo he's got to go, but when Milo says, you're so obsessed with 40 so much that maybe if you weren't, you would have noticed that your husband was sick earlier. And that's just something that crossed the line. So Love once again tells him he's got to go, and at this point, Joe even steps in and says, dude, you got to go. She said you have to leave. Milo tries to act like Tommy Toughnuts, but eventually he does leave. Afterwards, Love chastises both Joe and 40 for, quote, sticking up for her, and while 40's laughing about it, Joe does apologize. As Joe leaves, Love says, hey, you are a really good friend to 40, and she calls him Joe. And the fact that she used his actual name means the world to Joe. But Joe is leaving because he was going to go have dinner with Delilah. And the problem with that is Delilah got a phone call from her cop friend that said, I remember your buddy. I was going to arrest him for jaywalking, but he had these really expensive pair of headphones. And I looked him up, and he makes $12 an hour. So then I started thinking, what is a guy like that doing with expensive headphones that he's just going to get rid of? And not only that, I found him the night that Henderson was murdered. And those just so happen to be headphones that Henderson endorsed. Now, at first, Delilah just thinks that the cop is just being jealous, but then the more she thinks about it, the more she gets curious, and she heads on into his apartment. Initially, she doesn't find anything, but eventually she finds the storage facility key. And when she heads over there, she sees the cage, she sees the box, she sees Henderson's computer, and she immediately calls her cop friend, but he doesn't answer. She goes to leave, but Joe has showed up, and he closes the door and says, When my ex-girlfriend showed up, I got a nanny cam and I saw you take the key. And he's really upset because he was planning on asking her to dinner that night, but now he's got this to deal with. At this point, the cop is calling back and Delilah gives Joe her phone and Joe knocks her out and puts her in the cage. And when she wakes up, Joe says, look, I'm not going to hurt you, but I just need a few days to get my affairs in order and then I'll let you go. In episode 8, Delilah is begging Joe to let her out, but he just can't do that even though he wants to. And as she's begging, the cop Fincher calls back, and Joe looks at her and says, did you tell him about this place? And she says, no, not yet. Let me prove to you that I will not tell the cops. So Joe answers the phone, and Delilah plays it off like she was calling Fincher to try to get a hold of him because she wanted to know about a celebrity DUI, and she does not reveal her location or what is going on. But even after that show of loyalty, Joe can't let her out just yet. He needs her to spend a night in the cage as he plans to get the hell out of Los Angeles. So that morning, he books a flight to Mexico, writes a letter to Love, and buys handcuffs that have a timing mechanism on it. He sets the handcuffs for 16 hours and chains her to the table and says, this will give me enough time to get out of Los Angeles, and as soon as they're out, you're good to go. I'll even leave the door unlocked, and there's your cell phone. And in his mind, Joe thinks he truly has changed by doing this. He doesn't need to kill Delilah. His next stop is to a Navran to drop off that letter to Love, and she's busy doing a cake testing for her two friends, but they know something's wrong with her. They ask if it has to do with Milo, and she says, no, I haven't thought about him in months. He really means nothing to me. It's actually about Will. And they have a conversation about maybe he deserves a second chance, but Joe is watching this conversation go down thinking, unfortunately, there isn't going to be a second chance. He drops the letter off in her locker, but then he gets interrupted by 40, who says, you're not going to believe this. Catherine Bigelow wants to do the Beck film. 40 pitched Catherine Bigelow at a Dungeons and Dragons meeting, and she loved the idea and wants to see a script ASAP, and he wants Joe to look over the script before he leaves. So Joe agrees to give him 30 minutes, and as he's giving him some pointers, these two guys roll up in an SUV, put bags over their heads, and basically kidnap him. While in the car, 40 admits that this probably has to do with a gambling debt because he's an addict. But when they get to their destination, the hoods come off, and they're in a hotel room, and 40 looks like he knows these guys. And that's because he does. He hired these two guys, one of them's named Dimitri, to basically make sure they don't leave this hotel room until a script is written. And Dimitri actually has shoot-on-sight orders if they do end up escaping. And since Joe is on borrowed time, he is pissed off. And Dimitri has his license and passport, so unfortunately Joe is stuck there until they write a script. And since Ellie got the assistant job, she's in the room next door and she comes in to help them write this script. And it seems like after a couple of hours, they finally have a script finished and 40's happy with it, but Ellie says, I just don't think this is good. And in his mind, Joe is cursing Ellie for doing this because this is finally his way out. But Ellie says, this isn't from Beck's perspective. Honestly, I think you need to start from scratch. I think you need to start the whole thing over again. It's predictable, and honestly, it's just not that great. It's not special. And this is the last thing that Joe wanted to hear, but it's also the last thing that 40 wanted to hear because he doesn't deal with criticism too well. And when he hears this, he says, I gotta get out of here. But instead of walking out the front door because of Dimitri, he jumps out the window into the dumpster down below. And since 40 is his way to getting back his stuff, Joe jumps out the window after him. Joe finally finds him in a bar, and 40 has been thrown back tequila, but he was nice enough to buy Joe a seltzer water. And 40's just depressed at himself, and even reveals that he's such a loser he's still talking to Candace. That's how broken he is. But for the life of him, Joe can't figure out why you're still talking to Candace. But it's because 40 wants a woman in his life. 40 wants that love. And when he sees a couple that just got married, he stands up and says, attention everybody, I will give these newlyweds $10,000 if I could hook up with the wife. And $10,000 is a lot of money, so 40's able to do it, and he gives the money, but this is the first time that Joe is seeing this side of 40, the destructive side, the side that's willing to break up a marriage before it even begins. And that's when he realizes 40 is truly dangerous. So at this point, Joe says, you know what, I'm out of here. And 40 grabs his arm and writes a time down and says, you're going to want to know what that time is. Because 40 spiked his drink full of LSD, and not just any kind of LSD, 4 times the amount. And it's going to set in a little bit, and he's eventually going to want to know what time he started drinking. So now that's another issue that he has to deal with as he makes his way back to the hotel. Love, meanwhile, has been invited to dinner from her mother at the advice of her new shaman. And while Love is reluctant to go, she ends up accepting the invite. But when she's at dinner, Love realizes this attempt to make amends isn't what it seems like, because the family is just constantly covering up lies. Her mother tells her that her dad is cheating once again, but acts like it's okay, and it's not. The family lies about the fact that 40 is a ticking time bomb. And at this point, Love is sick of it. Now, it probably has to do with the fact that she's been drinking all night, but she stands up to her mother. She ends up running out of the restaurant and running into Joe at the hotel because she was looking for him. She tracked him down thanks to 40's Instagram and figured he would be there. And she tells Joe that the letter that he wrote her really shook her to her core. And if he's truly leaving Los Angeles, she wants to have one last goodbye with him tomorrow at lunch. The problem is Joe's not saying anything because the LSD just kicked in and he is tripping balls. Love ends up throwing up and her mother comes and finds her and apologizes to Joe, and Joe ends up finding his way back to the room. But he's tripping so badly that when 40 wants to roleplay between Dr. Nikki and Beck, he takes it too far because as 40's talking, he's literally hearing Beck's voice and it's triggering for him. So he starts choking 40 and literally trying to kill him until 40 ends up kneeing him in the balls to get him off of him. And 40 loves this version of method acting and thinks he's found a breakthrough and tells Joe, if you want to leave, give Dimitri the safe word and he'll let you go. But you can only use it once. And while Joe is livid about the fact that there was a safe word the entire time, he uses it. The next thing Joe remembers, though, is that he's in a bathroom and his hands are covered in blood. As he frantically washes the blood off, all of a sudden it disappears and his hands are fine. He has no idea how he got there, and when he walks out of the bathroom, he's in the hotel room again. 40 is rolling with this new script, and he asks him how long he's been gone, and 40 says, I don't know, maybe an hour, maybe 3. Who's to say? I was kind of in the zone. Then Joe asks, hey, were my hands covered in blood when I came back? And he says, it's hard to say. I'm tripping too, and every time I look down at your hands, I just saw lobsters. So then Joe goes out in the hallway and asks Dimitri, hey, was my hands covered in blood when I came back? And Dimitri says, no, your hands were clean. And of course, Joe is worried that he killed somebody in this time span that he can't account for. Joe then gets a phone call from Love, and she tells him she wants to be in this relationship with him. She wants to be with him. The problem is Delilah's still in a cage, and she's going to be getting out in a few hours. So Joe says, all right, how about we just pick up and run away together? But Love won't leave 40 behind, so Joe says, all right, we'll bring him with us. And Joe wants desperately to be with Love, but it can't be in Los Angeles because of Delilah. They tell each other that they love each other and they hang up, but as soon as he does so, he starts to hallucinate about his mother. His mom is telling him how he hasn't changed, and he's already thinking of ways to get rid of 40, but Joe is reassuring her, no, I have, and that's not true. He starts arguing with this hallucination and eventually makes it out of the bathroom, and when he does, 40 is sitting there saying, I've cracked it, I've figured this out. Dr. Nikki didn't kill Beck. Dr. Nikki was set up by the boyfriend. Joe says, what boyfriend? And he says, yeah, she mentioned him a few times, not many, but that's who did it. And at this point, Joe is worried that 40 actually did figure this thing out, so he grabs a jagged piece of glass and starts walking towards him. And he's even encouraged to stab 40 in the jugular by that hallucination of his mother, but 40 says, do you know I know? Because that's what I did. 40 then goes on to reveal that he ended up killing that au pair. That was the first love of his life, but when he found out that she was dating a college guy, he blacked out, and when he woke up, there she was dead. At this point, Joe puts that jagged piece of glass down and goes to console 40 about this, because 40 has been living with this burden since the age of 13. And while the family paid to make it go away, it's never gone away for 40. As Joe reminds 40 that it's okay, he was just a kid, and he's hugging him, 40 says, look, I don't know what's up with you and my sister, but she'd be an idiot to let you go. Joe wakes up the next morning on the couch, and he has about an hour to go until the handcuffs unlock. He can't find 40 anywhere, but he races over to the storage unit. He wants to try to bargain with Delilah, but when he opens it, he finds Delilah's dead body because somebody slashed Delilah's throat. In episode 9, Joe is trying to figure out who exactly killed Delilah. He doesn't think it was him, but he feels like he owes it to her to find out if it was. He's trying to retrace his steps, but there's so much time that's not accounted for. He tries to get in touch with 40, but he's not answering his phone calls. He also tries to put Ellie's mind at ease by texting her through Delilah's phone, but he ends up dropping it and breaking it. And then he starts thinking about possible suspects that could have done that aren't him. And the real Will Biddleheim pops into his head because he's the only other person that knows about that cage, and maybe he came back. And the real Will sent him a postcard with his phone number, so when he calls it up, he sees Gigi and he sees Will and he realizes he didn't do it. But the real Will can see that something's not right with Joe and asks what's wrong. And Joe doesn't exactly describe the situation, but describes the situation enough where Will figures it out. There's a dead body in your cage and you don't know if you did it or not. Will tells him that he does believe that Joe is a good person, but deep down, Joe is the only person that knows if he's capable of that or not. So Joe continues to think and heads home and meets Love at his apartment. And while they're discussing their phone call from the night before, Ellie shows up looking for her sister. Of course, no one's seen her. And Ellie's really concerned because she's been gone for so long, and on top of it, she received a death threat from a Henderson fan after that story went public. So Love tries to take her mind off things and asks her if she wants to go get food as Joe cleans himself up from the night before. And while getting dressed, he gets a flashback from the night before at a Novern where the manager was beating him thinking he was robbing the place. So he goes to leave for a Novern, but he runs into Delilah's cop friend Fincher. And Fincher asks, hey, have you seen Delilah? But Joe plays it off, no, I haven't, it's really weird. But he gives Fincher the death threat and tells him how concerned he is about her safety because her sister hasn't seen her either. Right as he's about to leave, he says, by the way, she broke things off with me, so I really think she likes you, man. So he arrives at a Novern and the manager lets him know what happened the night before and lets him know how messed up he was and lets him know the time he arrived. But then he says, by the way, just because you're with 40 doesn't mean you don't have to pay for that stuff. And Joe is surprised to hear that he was with 40 because 40 could very well be his alibi. So Joe heads over to 40's place since he can't get a hold of him, and he texts Love that he's doing so. And Love is cooking with Ellie, and Ellie is still very concerned about her sister because her sister is the only real person she has. Her dad died when she was younger and she doesn't get along with her mother and abandoned her to go live with Delilah. And Joe is trying to figure out who killed Delilah, but when he knocks on 40's door, his mom answers. His mom lets him know, hey, I know that 40 told you about our family secret. Just to let you know, we are a close-knit family and all your secrets are safe with us. But Joe doesn't take it as a reassuring statement. He kind of takes it as a threat. And then he's wondering, what exactly did I tell 40 last night? And then he starts to remember little bits and pieces and wonders, oh my God, what if 40 did it? At this point, 40 shows up and he starts asking, hey, where did we go after Navrin? But 40's being skittish about giving details. Joe can tell he's lying. It doesn't take much, though, for 40 to finally come clean and say, you know, this is all your fault. If you didn't call Delilah for a booty call, I wouldn't have had to call Candace for one. And through that, he remembers that 40 dropped him off at the storage facility and then went to go hook up with Candace. And 40 gave him a rose to give to Delilah that was found next to her body in the cage. So it's very possible that Joe could have just added to his body count. But he suddenly gets a phone call from Love who says, you gotta come back because Ellie is losing her shit. And when he gets there, she is indeed losing her shit. Because it's finally hitting her that something probably happened to Delilah. Delilah's never left Ellie alone this long, but the real issue for Ellie is, why don't people want to be with me? What's wrong with me? And Joe comforts her by saying, nothing's wrong with you. Don't ever think that. And while Love is watching this go down thinking it's a beautiful moment, Joe is staring back at her thinking, I could have very well killed her sister. After he calms Ellie down, he heads back to the storage facility to see if he can find any clues and figure this thing out. While he does that, Candace shows up at 40's praising his script, but 40 doesn't want her there. 40 says, what happened last night was a mistake, and you truly are crazy. And if it wasn't for the fact that Joe called Delilah for a booty call, I never would have called you. Candace is just amazed that he called Delilah the building manager and is now worried for her safety. The two get into a fight with Candace saying, you idiot, you cracked this thing. Joe is the boyfriend. Joe Goldberg killed Beck. And I'm trying to protect you and your family from a killer. But 40 is just brushing it off, not believing a word she's saying, just figuring that she's crazy. Candace storms out and says, well, when he kills your sister, don't come running to me. At this point, Candace is very frustrated and goes to the liquor store. And as she's sitting there drinking, she rewatches the video that 40 sent her from the night before. And sure enough, in the background, you can see the storage facility and you can see Joe. So Candace immediately heads over to that storage facility and catches Joe in the cage with Delilah's dead body and pepper sprays him. She grabs his phone and locks him in there and texts Love Quinn the address and says, I need you here now, from his cell phone. And Candace thinks she finally has the proof she needed. But when Love shows up, she thinks this was Candace's doing. She thinks she's nuts. She demands that Candace set him free, but Joe's had time to think about this and figures, you know what, this is what I deserve. And to both of their surprise, he comes clean about everything. He says, Candace is right. I killed Henderson. I killed Beck. I tried to kill her. I clearly killed Delilah. And this is the first time Joe is really admitting guilt, because this all stems from his childhood, where the first time he killed somebody was his father at the age of 9. And when he did so, his mother said, you're not a bad person. You were protecting me. It was an accident. And that's exactly what he tells himself every time he murders somebody, is that he was protecting them. But now he's finally coming clean about it. And his admission forces Love to run out of the storage facility. Candace runs after her, and now it's just Joe alone in the cage. And he finds that spare key that he hid in the cage just in case of emergencies, but he actually throws it out of one of the air holes. At this point, Joe feels like he deserves to get caught. Candace at this point is caught up to Love, and she's trying to console her as she's throwing up, but Love turns around and slashes her throat. She heads back to the cage, and she stares at Joe, picking up the key, and Joe says, what did you do? Where's Candace? And she just looks at him and says, I took care of it. In the season finale, Joe is trying to figure out why Love came back to help him. I mean, after all, he killed Beck, he killed Henderson, he killed Delilah, and she cuts him off and says, you didn't kill Delilah, I did. She goes on to explain that when she was a kid, she saw 40 with that au pair, and she knocked out 40 with a brick and slit the au pair's throat. She put the knife in 40's hands, and it was probably for the best, but the family covered it up. And she did it because she was protecting 40. And when she got married, she couldn't have a family with her husband, and she thought she was just stuck with this toxic family. But when she met Joe, she, just like Joe, figured she could fix Joe. And after Candace dropped that bombshell, she started having that PI follow Joe. She found out his true identity. She read Beck's book cover to cover. And when she found the storage key, she went in, but she wasn't disgusted at what she found. She actually found it kind of endearing. And when he was about to run away and take their potential future with him, she couldn't let that happen. So she followed him that night to the storage facility. And when he left the storage facility, she went in, and of course Delilah is freaking out saying Will is crazy, but she wasn't willing to let Delilah get in the way of their future and slit her throat and killed her. And Joe is listening to this entire story thinking that she is absolutely batshit insane, not realizing the hypocrisy of the situation. Joe asks her, what do you plan on doing with Ellie? But Love has come up with a plan. She's going to give the cops an anonymous tip that it was Ellie who killed Henderson, and she's going to get arrested, but the Quinn's lawyers are going to get her out of it because there's no real evidence. At this point, the body of Delilah is going to appear with a suicide note, and it's going to look like she's a martyr. Ellie, because she got arrested with no real evidence, is going to get a huge settlement check to start up her real life. And all of this will take the heat off of Joe killing Delilah and killing Henderson. Joe says that's never going to work, but Love tells him that the Quinns basically have the LAPD in their pocket. Joe says, please tell me you didn't already give the cops that anonymous tip, but she has, and Fincher shows up at Ellie's apartment. He starts subtly asking her about that night, but she's too smart and she's seen too many movies and knows what's going on, and he takes her downtown. But because the way that Joe is looking at Love at the moment, she can't let him go. She figured that she could open up to who she really was because she knew who he really was, but his face is saying otherwise. So Joe is locked up and Ellie's locked up, and she calls up 40 to get her out of there, saying, can you call whatever favors you did for my sister and Joe and get me out of here? They think I had something to do with Henderson's murder. And 40 can't help her because he's on the East Coast, but says, I'll send my family lawyer over, you'll be out of there like in an hour. And 40's on the East Coast because he's going to meet with Dr. Nikki. After Candace told him you cracked the case, he went on some conspiracy theorist forums and read all about the Free Dr. Nikki movement. And when he talks to Dr. Nikki, the first thing he says is, I don't think you killed Guinevere Beck. And Dr. Nikki's like, yeah, no shit. But Dr. Nikki at this point is kind of at peace with being in there because he says, I'm not a great guy. And while I'm not guilty of killing Guinevere Beck, I'm guilty of a lot of bad shit, so I deserve to be in here. And then 40 brings up that patient that Dr. Nikki had that they couldn't really find any information on, and Dr. Nikki's reluctant to talk about it until 40 slaps up a picture of 40 and Joe onto the glass. Dr. Nikki's taken aback and says, oh my god, that's whatever fake name Joe gave him. You probably should stay away from him, he's very dangerous. So if 40 had any doubts about Joe, he no longer has them. He's frantically calling up Love to get a hold of her, but she's sending him straight to voicemail as he disposes of Candace's body. At this point, the Quinn's family lawyer has shown up for Ellie, and as she's walking out of the station, Fincher says, by the way, if we don't hear from your sister in a couple hours, I'm going to call Child Protective Services and report an unattended minor. And at this point, she's really freaked out because she has no idea where her sister is. She didn't kill Henderson, and she texts 40 and says, where are you? 40 just arrived back in Los Angeles and says, meet me at a Navarin. Fincher, on the other hand, doesn't really have anything to do, and he decides to tail her because he still thinks that she had something to do with Henderson's murder. Joe, meanwhile, is trying to figure out how to get out of the cage, and he figures the best option is to think like Beck did. Lure Love into the cage and then get yourself out of it. And he's planning on using the handcuffs to do so, because at this point, he still thinks that Love is insane. When Love arrives that day, she brings him baked muffins, and he's very hesitant to eat them because he's worried that they're poison. Love freaks out and eats one and says, seriously, you think they poisoned you? And he makes up a lie and says, no, I just can't eat with a decomposing body 3 feet away from me. Can you please let me out? He's very convincing, and Love opens the door and starts to step into the cage, but because of the reflection, she sees the hidden handcuffs, and that's when he grabs her, chokes her, and is about to stab her in the jugular with it, but she screams, I'm pregnant, and Joe freezes in his tracks. She goes on to say that it's Joe's because she made Milo use protection and she thinks it's a girl. She explains that she didn't want to kill Delilah, but she just had taken the test and she couldn't let Delilah ruin their future family. And Love thinks that he hates her because he just tried to kill her, but when she told him that she was pregnant, his whole mood changed because he grew up with a really shitty father, and now he thinks that he can make a difference in this baby's life. So he tells her that I don't hate you, love doesn't evaporate. And then she asks, would it be weird if you still come to Lucy and Sunrise's wedding? And Joe does, and yeah, it's a little weird for him. But at the wedding, he finally realizes that maybe he is in fact staring at himself, just like Candace said. But it's also possible that he forgives Love and they go on and have a really good life together. And after the ceremony, Joe looks at Love and says, I love you. And she says, still? And he says, no. More. But 40 is blowing up both of their phones because he tried to get into the wedding, but Gabe shut him down. And he's texting Joe, calling him all sorts of names, saying, I know what you did, meet me in a Navarin right now. And he's texting Love saying, Love, you gotta get away from him, he's dangerous. So they both head over to a Navarin, and Love says, I'll go in first to calm him down, you stay in the car. But he sees Ellie popping out from behind a dumpster. And unbeknownst to the both of them, Fincher is watching this all go down from afar. And Ellie wants to know where Delilah is because Child Protective Services is going to be coming after her, but she also wants to know if Joe had a hand in it because 40 is in there ranting and raving about how Joe killed all these people. And Joe looks at her and says, does that sound like something I would do? But she asks, did you hurt Delilah? And he doesn't lie, he says no, but he lets her know the Quinns are very powerful people, and I don't think Delilah is coming back, and you need to prepare for that. And as Love is trying to talk down 40, Joe sneaks into the office, goes into the safe, and starts clearing it out and giving it to Ellie to get out of town. He gives her the bag and says, you take this and you go east. And she goes, well, I'm 15 years old. What am I supposed to do? And he says, you're smart enough. Start a new life. I'm the one who killed Henderson. I'm not a good person, but those people, they're even worse, and I'm your buffer between that. So take this stuff, go start a new life. I'll send you money every couple of months to make sure you're okay, but you need to get out of here and away from these people. And as you can imagine, Ellie is pissed off and tells him to go to hell, but she does take the money and goes out the side door. After Ellie leaves, Joe walks in and catches Love and 40 arguing about Joe and who he really is and what he's done. And Joe tries to calmly talk to him about this, but then 40 pulls a gun out. Love is also trying to talk her brother down, saying you don't have to hurt him, but 40 says if you knew what I knew, you would want to hurt him. I'm going to protect you because you always protected me. And then Love tries one last plea by saying if you shoot him, you're never going to see me again, and you're also never going to see this baby. 40 looks at her and she says, yep, our baby. Because me and Joe are having a baby. We're going to have a family. But this doesn't make 40 happy. In fact, it pisses him off even more. He looks at her and says, you're just as broken as I am. What are you doing bringing a child into the world like us? You think I don't know? You think after all these years I'm that dumb? I've tiptoed around it my entire life, but you're crazy if you think you'd be a good mother. Joe tries to level with him and says, don't take this out on your sister. Take it out on me. So 40 does. He makes him get on his knees and is about to shoot him execution style until Fincher runs in, sees what's going on, and shoots 40. Love collapses to the ground attending to her dead brother's body, and at that moment, Joe knows that she needs me more than ever. So Joe Goldberg dodges a bullet, literally this time, once again. Him and Love get out of there, and the cops figure that it must have been 40 who killed Henderson because he was also in the house, and because he's a Quinn, the Quinn swept it under the rug. Joe is still getting regular mail from the real Will Biddleheim, although he hasn't responded in a while. He's also getting a postcard from Ellie, who lets him know that she found a place and send more money in about 3 months, so it seems like she's kind of gotten over things. Joe and Love have bought a house, and Love's mother's there helping them move in, and she's very pregnant. And it seems like Joe finally has everything he ever wanted in life. That is, until he sees the next door neighbor. And she has a stack of books and the attention of Joe Goldberg. And that is how Season 2 of You ends. Thank you so much for watching this recap or listening to it. Please hit the subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. There's a thumbs up button there if you liked it. There's a thumbs down button there if you don't. And there's also a share button. So if you know somebody that needs a recap of You Season 2, please pass this along to them. I tend to stay away from the comment section, so if you say something and I don't respond, please don't take it personally. But just know, I do really appreciate you guys checking this video out.